So Donald Trump wants to play hero again. In January 2026, he sent a letter to Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi offering to restart U.S. mediation to solve the dispute over Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam. He called it his top priority for lasting peace in the Middle East and Africa. But here's what Trump conveniently forgot to mention, and what the media isn't telling you. This is the same Donald Trump who just 4 years ago, in 2020, stood in the Oval Office and told Egypt to blow up the dam. So, why is Donald Trump suddenly the peacemaker? What's the real game here? And why does the Western world think it has any right to tell Ethiopia what to do with water that flows through its own territory? This is Africa Decode. Subscribe to the channel where we decode African issues. Allow me to take you back to October 23, 2020. Trump was announcing a deal to normalize relations between Sudan and Israel, completely unrelated to the Nile, right? But in the middle of that call, with Sudanese and Israeli leaders on speakerphone, Trump went off script. He started ranting about Ethiopia's dam, and this is what he said.
But they built a dam which stops water from flowing into the Nile. And you can't blame Egypt for being a little bit upset, right? So I had a deal done, and then they broke the deal, and they can't do that. They can't do that. So the deal was done, and it's a very dangerous situation because Egypt is not going to be able to live that way. And they'll end up blowing up the dam. And I said it, and I say it loud and clear. They'll blow up that dam, and they have to do something. So whatever you can do to get them, Ethiopia, to do that, they're going to have to, okay?
Think about that. The President of the United States, supposedly a neutral mediator, is publicly encouraging Egypt to commit an act of war against a sovereign nation. Not diplomacy, not negotiation, blow it up. Ethiopia's response was immediate and furious. The foreign ministry summoned the U.S. ambassador and called Trump's statement an incitement of war. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's office said the threats were misguided, unproductive, and clear violations of international law, adding that Ethiopia will not cave into aggression of any kind. Trump had no clue. He even claimed that the United States funded the dam, a complete lie that Ethiopia repeatedly had to debunk. The 4.6 billion Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was funded entirely through domestic resources. Ethiopian citizens bought bonds, the diaspora contributed, Chinese banks provided equipment financing. No $1 came from the United States. But Trump kept repeating the lie, perhaps because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that Ethiopia built this massive project without Western permission or money, and that drives imperialists crazy. So, fast forward to January 2026, Trump is back in office, and suddenly he is the peacemaker. In his letter to el-Sisi, Trump wrote that resolving the GERD dispute is at the top priority of his agenda. He promised that with the right technical expertise, fair and transparent negotiations, and a strong United States role, a deal could guarantee water for Egypt and Sudan while allowing Ethiopia to generate electricity. Egypt, of course, welcomed this with open arms. El-Sisi praised Trump's recognition of the Nile's importance and thanked him for his commitment to a fair agreement. Sudan's military leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is currently waging a genocidal civil war with support from Egypt, also welcomed Trump's mediation. But Ethiopia is silenced. No official response, no welcome, because Ethiopians remember what Trump said in 2020. They remember the threats. They remember the bias. They remember that during Trump's first mediation attempt in 2019 to 2020, the US drafted an agreement that was acceptable to Egypt, but completely unacceptable to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia walked away. And Trump got angry. Experts say his ego was bruised when Ethiopia refused to show up for what was supposed to be the final round of talks in Washington, D.C. So he cut off millions in aid to Ethiopia and publicly encouraged Egypt to destroy the dam. So why does Trump suddenly care again in 2026? Let me give you 3 reasons, and none of them have anything to do with African development or water equity. First is geopolitical leverage. Trump's want to use the GERD as a bargaining chip. Some analysts, including reports from Israeli media outlets, Marif, suggest Trump may be tying the dam issue to Egypt's participation in his plan to relocate Palestinians from Gaza. Think about it. Trump's offers to pressure Ethiopia into signing an agreement favorable to Egypt, and in exchange, Egypt cooperated with its Middle East agenda, its classic quid pro quo. Secondly, is propping up his favorite dictator. Trump has openly called Sisi his favorite dictator. Egypt's economy is in crisis. The country faces a water deficit of 7 billion cubic meters annually and is projected to be completely water scarce in the near future. Sisi needs a win, and Trump wants to give it to him, not because it's right, but because it maintains US influence in Egypt and keeps a compliant authoritarian in power. The third is the Nobel Prize obsession. This one sounds pathetic but real. Trump literally posted on Truth Social that he won't get a Nobel Peace Prize for keeping peace between Egypt and Ethiopia, listing it among achievements he believes deserve the prize. He's so desperate for validation that he's claiming credit for preventing a conflict that he himself incited. He even lied and said he ended the Nile Waters War in his first year in office, a war that never happened, and a dispute that remained unresolved. The man is delusional, but his delusions have real consequences for 120 million Ethiopians. Now let's talk about the bottom line that the Western media refuses to acknowledge. Ethiopia has every right to use the water resource within its own territory for development. Ethiopia has every right, not conditional, not subject to Egyptian approval, not dependent on colonial-era treaties that Ethiopia never signed. Ethiopia contributes 86% of the Nile's water. The Blue Nile, which originates in Ethiopia highlands, provides the vast majority of the water that flows into the Nile. The White Nile from Uganda and other tributaries contributes the rest. Egypt and Sudan have been benefiting from the Nile for centuries while Ethiopia starves. The 1959 Nile Water Agreement, signed by Egypt and Sudan without consulting Ethiopia or any other upstream nation, allocated 55.5 billion cubic meters of water annually to Egypt and 18.5 billion cubic meters to Sudan. That's 74 billion cubic meters total out of 84 billion. They left 10 billion for evaporation, 0 for Ethiopia, 0 for the other 8 upstream countries, 0 for the nations that actually produce the water. This isn't just unfair, it's colonial robbery codified into international law. The 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty gave Egypt veto power over any construction project on the Nile and its tributaries. Britain signed this treaty on behalf of its colonies, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, without their consent. Ethiopia, which was never colonized, was simply excluded. When Egypt and Sudan signed the 1959 agreement updating these allocations, they didn't invite Ethiopia to the table. They just declared that if other riparian countries ever made claims to Nile water, those claims would be stated, and any water allocated would be deducted equally from Egypt and Sudan's share, as if Ethiopia's water belongs to Cairo and Khartoum first. So it's the most brazen example of resource theft in modern history, and Egypt still defends it as its historical and natural rights. Meanwhile, 65 million Ethiopians lack access to electricity. The country relies on rain-fed agriculture, making millions vulnerable to drought and famine. Ethiopian children die from hunger, while Egypt takes 66% of water that originates in Ethiopian territory. But when Ethiopia finally builds a dam with its own money on its own land to generate electricity to put its people out of poverty, the West calls it a threat. Trump tells Egypt to blow it up, and the world expects Ethiopia to negotiate away its sovereignty. Egypt loves to invoke international law and its historical rights, but let's be clear about what that means. The 1959 agreement is not international law. It's a bilateral treaty between two countries. Ethiopia is not a party to it. The agreement has no legal standing over Ethiopia. The United Nations Watercourse Convention, which Egypt hasn't even ratified, established principles of equitable and reasonable use, no significant harms, and duty to cooperate. Um, the 1959 agreement violates all of these principles. Colonial-era treaties signed by Britain are not binding on Ethiopia. The 1902 Anglo-Ethiopian Treaty, which Britain claims limits Ethiopia's use of the Blue Nile, is contested. Ethiopia argues that the Amharic version, which is what Emperor Menelik II signed, says something different from the English version, and even if valid, it only provides total blockage of water flow, not reasonable use. But here's the key. Ethiopia was never colonized. These treaties were imposed by colonial powers to benefit their interests. The Nyerere Doctrine, named after Tanzania's first president, asserts that former colonies have no obligation to abide by treaties signed for them by colonizers. If that applies to colonized nations, how much more does it apply to Ethiopia, which was never colonized in the first place? So Egypt's existential threats argument is misleading. Yes, Egypt depends on the Nile for 97% of its water, but Ethiopia isn't stopping the flow. The GERD is a hydraulic dam, not a consumptive use. The water passes through the turbines and continues downstream. During drought years, the dam can actually regulate flow and prevent floods, benefiting Egypt and Sudan. Egypt's real fear isn't water scarcity, it's loss of control. For a century, Egypt has controlled the Nile unilaterally. Now Ethiopia is asserting its sovereignty, and Egypt can accept that a black African nation upstreams one bow to Cairo's demands. So what's the solution? Here's what I think Ethiopia should do. First, ignore Trump. The United States is not an honest broker. Trump proved that in 2020 when he told Egypt to blow up the dam. His 2026 mediation offer is a trap. Any agreement brokered by Trump will favor Egypt because that serves U.S. geopolitical interest. Ethiopia should refuse to participate in any US-led negotiation. Second to that is continue operating the dam. The GERD was inaugurated in September 2025. It's done, it's operational. Ethiopia should continue generating power, exporting electricity to neighboring countries, and using their revenue to develop its economy. The dam is a source of immense national pride. It should remain that way. Third is negotiate directly with Egypt and Sudan through the African Union. The African Union has been overseeing talks and there's been progress. Focus on technical agreements about data sharing and drought management, but Ethiopia should never sign any agreement that limits its sovereign right to use water within its own territory or gives Egypt veto power over future development. Fourth is that build alliance with other upstream nations. The Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement was signed by Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and Burundi. These countries all reject the 1959 agreement. Together, they have the power to force Egypt to accept a new equitable framework. Ethiopia shouldn't stand alone. The fifth is expose Western hypocrisy. Every time Trump or the US talks about international law, Ethiopia should publicly ask which international law. The colonial treaties Ethiopia never signed, the 1959 agreements between Egypt and Sudan that excluded 8 upstream nations, or the United Nations Watercourse Convention that Egypt refused to ratify. So make the world see that this isn't about law, it's about power, and Ethiopia refuses to be bullied. So Donald Trump is not a hero, he's not a peacemaker. He's a hypocrite who told one country to blow up another country's infrastructure, then 4 years later offer to mediate the dispute he helped inflame. He wants a Nobel Prize, he wants to bolster his favorite dictator, he wants to leverage for his geopolitical games. None of that has anything to do with justice for Ethiopia or equity in the Nile Basin. Ethiopia has every right to develop its water resources. Full stop. No colonial treaty, no Egyptian veto, no American pressure changes that fundamental truth. For a century, Egypt and Sudan benefited from Nile water while Ethiopia starved. The era is over, the dam is built, the water is flowing, and Ethiopia's sovereignty is non-negotiable. The world needs to recognize that African nations are not pawns in Western games. Ethiopia is not asking for permission, it's exercising its rights. And if Donald Trump doesn't like it, too bad. Ethiopia doesn't need his approval, it never did. Thank you for watching.